Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for this session. My name is Chris Benner. I'm a professor at the University of California, Santa Cruz in the Environmental Studies and Sociology departments. And I also direct a center called the Institute for Social Transformation. And I'm going to be the moderator for our discussion today with a panelist to talk about links between economics, climate change, and racial justice movements. And we really want to encourage you to be part of this conversation. And you can do that by putting questions in the chat box on the side of the screen. And we'll make sure to get to your questions and be in dialogue with you towards the latter half of our time together. So the jumping off point for our conversation today is solidarity economics. These are ideas that hopefully many of you heard earlier today. Our keynote speaker, Manuel Pastor, sharing many of the ideas that are in a book that we co-authored and just released, which tries to distill ideas from really many decades of research and engagement with movements for social, economic, and environmental justice. And thinking about in this moment, coming out of the pandemic and all of the racial justice movements of the last couple of years, and of course, the environmental crisis that we're in the midst of, for creating a unifying economic framework that can help strengthen our movements towards building a stronger and better economy. And the core of that economy that we're envisioning, I think all of us, is solidarity. As Manuel said in his keynote speech, we all have instincts for mutuality. And part of what we're trying to do in this conversation and the ideas in solidarity economics is figure out how do we make our instincts for mutuality more strongly reflected in our economy. And today's conversation is really thinking about those links between our economy and our work towards environmental justice and racial justice that's central to that. And I want to say just a couple of things about some of the ideas in the book, just to echo some of what Manuel said earlier today. And part of that is we're trying to lay out a vision of an alternative economy, solidarity economy. And many people have done that, and we've learned from that as well. Part of what we're trying to recognize in this book is that we don't have to start from scratch in building our solidarity economy, that in fact, much of the way our economy already operates is built on mutuality. And our current neoliberal economic framework blinds us to the reality that the care economy and collaboration and caring is essential a part of how our economy operates. And of course, that's true when we think about the planet. We have to be in solidarity with the planet, the connection with our environmental resources and the air we breathe, the water we drink, the places we live and work and play, in order for our economy to survive. But because we have this model of neoliberal economics that has us separated from the economy and doesn't account for the economy as part of the environment as part of our economy, we're blinded to the reality of that solidarity with the planet. And that as part of that, we can recognize that when we invest in that mutuality with the planet and with each other, in fact, our economy does better. And that's part of what we try and show in the book through research and engagement and language. And central to that is a recognition that environmental equity, when there's less inequality and exposure to environmental pollutants, in fact, the environment overall is better for most of us. And so environmental equity and racial equity is fundamentally linked with environmental quality. And finally, of course, to get to strengthening this mutuality in our economy and our environmental movements, in our environmental systems, we need movements for environmental justice. So that's the central points of the book. In fact, in solidarity with our readers, the book itself is free to download from our website, solidarityeconomics.org. And we'll now jump into the conversation, and I want to bring in our panelists. And first, to introduce my co-author, Manuel Pastor, who most of you have seen earlier today. He is a distinguished professor of sociology and American studies and ethnicity at the University of Southern California, and he's also director of the Equity Research Institute. And thanks for being with us today, Manuel.
Glad to be here.
And our other two panelists we asked to join us because of their particular expertise in the combination of working at a grassroots local neighborhood level and large-scale policy change and political alliance building, particularly at a state level, but also with connections, of course, to some of the global movements that are part of that. Natalie Hernandez is Associate Director of Climate Planning and Resilience at an organization called Climate Resolve. She's a Los Angeles region-based specialist in environmental policy and community planning. For those who don't know, Climate Resolve was founded in 2010 and focuses on building collaborations for equitable climate solutions, connecting communities, organizations, and policymakers to address global climate problems with local action. And the organization prioritizes working with communities most affected by climate change impacts, which are predominantly Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And also joining us is Nailah Pope Harden, Executive Director of ClimatePlan. Nailah has years of community organizing experience spanning neighborhood, regional, state, and national environmental justice campaigns. She's based in South Sacramento as Executive Director of ClimatePlan and manages their work on state policy campaigns, mobilizing partner organizations, providing analysis on policy, state investments, and legislations, and building strong relationships with state agencies. And for those of you who don't know, ClimatePlan was founded in 2007. It's a California statewide coalition of more than 50 partners representing a broad range of interests, everything from urban planning and public health to farmland preservationists, all dedicated to planning for a sustainable and equitable future. And the organization particularly focuses on land use and transportation planning to protect California's health, our communities, our environment, and our climate. So Natalie and Nailah, thank you so much for joining us today. And Natalie, maybe I'll start with you and love to hear you talk a little bit in your own work. How are you approaching this relationship between climate change, racial justice, and our economy, particularly in this moment as we've just experienced the last couple of years of turmoil?
Thanks, Chris. Happy to be here and talk a little bit about Climate Resolve. For Climate Resolve, I think in all of our work, I do a lot of place-based projects, and it's on centering the voices of the most vulnerable, which Chris mentioned often includes Black, Indigenous, and people of color. But it's also going beyond that to think about people experiencing homelessness, outdoor workers, people with disabilities and access challenges, and then rural communities or mountainside communities. So Climate Resolve just helped facilitate a process with the county to have 400 participants create this climate vulnerability assessment. It's getting a lot of attention, and I can drop a link into the chat after. But we facilitated this process. We had about 6 listening sessions with some of the populations that I just mentioned. And we also had an advisory committee and public workshops. And some of the key findings of the report are about workforce and availability to shift during certain climate emergencies, whether that's like a heat wave, a wildfire. And key examples that were given in this report were about outdoor workers facing a decision when there is a really hot day to work or not. And there is kind of a lack of protection against that and like their wage loss. So a lot of people do choose to continue to work outdoors, and therefore there's public health impacts from heat exhaustion or just not being able to hydrate well, and ultimately could end up in the hospital. And so I think LA County is trying to figure out how to protect the most vulnerable populations like outdoor workers or people experiencing homelessness, people with access and disabilities. And so that was one way to think about like solidarity economics, like with this challenge. And Chris, please let me know how much time I have to talk about the question. I keep going.
Sorry, please go ahead and say more. It's fascinating to hear about sort of how you're applying this work in very practical levels.
Okay, well, I'll just give a few more examples. Some of the other things to think about relating to vulnerable populations and like the connection and trying to provide is energy infrastructure. When the power goes out, thinking about how people who are dependent on medical devices have access to their caregivers, backup power generation. That's also something that we're trying to uplift as an issue for the County of LA to prepare for, and having caregivers as liaisons. Then the other thing I would say is like transportation infrastructure, communications, trying to alert folks if there is a wildfire, how to get out or how to best be able to get to their home place. Because a lot of folks don't necessarily live where they work in LA. They're commuting very far to get to their job site. So making sure that the communications infrastructure is there, like so folks can get a text alert on their phone of what to do. And it's in a language that's accessible to them. There's a lot of these moving pieces, I think, but at the end of the day, Climate Resolve is trying to think about how to protect the most vulnerable in climate change.
So Natalie, maybe I'll just follow up a bit thinking about the economic dimensions of what you're describing. As I hear you talking, I mean, part of what I'm hearing is our economy and the work you're doing is people's lives, people's work that they're doing and those that are most vulnerable, people's need to move around to find jobs and connections, the need to have access to power and to be to have resilience and support in the threat of power outages.
Right.
Is that fair to describe that as sort of how you're thinking about our economy? And how does that link to sort of broader concepts about how we think about our economy?
We at Climate Resolve tend to talk about public health impacts of climate change to make it more relatable. And if we think about what we are going through with COVID and the public health impacts of not addressing the pandemic and trying to find solutions, I think it's the same with climate change. It's like if we don't address some of these changes like right away, I think there's actually like cascading impacts on the economy. Like that's also something that's uplifted in this recent report with the county is like heat wave can cause a power outage, and then a power outage can possibly cause someone to not be able to have their medical device and need power backup generation. A wildfire can cause folks to not have access to evacuation routes that they're used to taking. So I think going back to your question just about the economy is thinking about how can we prevent cascading impacts from a climate emergency event.
Yeah, awesome. Nailah, I want to bring you into this conversation and have you talk a little bit about your work at a statewide level and with the ClimatePlan Coalition. How are you thinking about these links between racial justice and climate change, particularly as it relates to our economy in this moment?
You know, ClimatePlan was started under this belief that we need to be working holistically together. And so we try and bring our whole selves to the work. And also we try and bring, the interconnectedness of issues to the work. So you can't talk about transportation policy without talking about land use policy. You can't talk about land use without talking about housing. And you can't talk about climate without talking about air quality. And so we need to have all of those people at the table. And if you're doing all of that and not putting some type of equity or racial lens on it, then you're just really wasting time. Because what we know is people with privilege, with means, with power are going to be able to buy their way out of this climate crisis as long as possible. And then folks that are on the ground in the BIPOC community, low-income communities, they're going to be the hardest hit. So if we're really serious about enacting climate change, then we need to be serious about doing racial justice and equity work.
So Nailah, I want to follow up a little bit because you mentioned all those different issues and you actually have quite an amazing network map on your website showing the organizations that are part of ClimatePlan and their work on everything from water to civic engagement to conservation to land use, housing, all the things that you mentioned. How do you keep that movement together, that coalition? And I'd love to hear you talk both about the challenges of doing that, because people come from very different perspectives and experiences around racial justice and climate justice work. But then also what you see as important for us to be thinking about and focusing on at this moment and going forward.
I think one of the ways that we keep the coalition together is we lean into uncomfortable conversations. And we lean into I want to spend every day arguing about how we reduce our emissions and not whether or not emissions are a thing. Hey, no, thank you. And so I think one of the ways we do that is by leaning into tough conversations, bringing our whole selves to the work. I think it's really important, though, to make sure that everyone is heard and that we're all working towards a common goal. Oh, thank you for the kisses. And we're all working towards a common goal. Everyone is trying to make the climate better. It's really about how, and understanding that there's multiple paths. We work together where we can, and where we disagree, we disagree.
You know, one of the things you're saying resonates with some of the things that Manuel and I have written about. And Manuel, I might ask you to sort of elaborate on this a bit, is the uncomfortable conversations are important. And part of what facilitates that is a sense of common destiny, that in fact our futures are somehow tied up with each other, and a commitment to ongoing conversations, that the face-to-face and race-to-race, place-to-place connections are important for working through those differences and figuring out how we come together. Manuel, I wonder if you wanted to talk a bit about that movement building element in this moment, and what do you see as being important for focusing on racial justice right now and strengthening and broadening our coalitions that are linking the racial justice and environmental justice work?
Great, thanks. And so delighted to be on this panel. First, as Chris knows, and I think we described to Natalie and Nailah, when we first turned in our first draft of this book to the publisher, we also handed it over to movement activists who gave us great feedback. One of the things that the publisher said was, my gosh, you're talking way too much about race and racism in this book. So in the next draft, we talked even more, because we think that unless those tough conversations take place, you can't find common ground. And the example that I often use for this, and it works particularly well if you have a live audience, but roll with me, which is, with a live audience, I ask how many people go to the gym. And usually hands go up. Some hands go up a little bit sheepishly because they might go to the gym not that frequently. And I say, well, what happens if you don't go to the gym often? When you show up, you make mistakes. You drop weights, you hurt yourself, you stretch your muscles, and no one in the gym wants to help you because they figure you're someone who's coming in January, but you're not going to be there in July. Not talking about race and racism every day is a little bit like that. You're going to make mistakes, and no one's going to be there to pick you up. But if you make sure that it becomes part of you and your organization's daily conversations, then people will call you in versus calling you out. They will understand that you're making the effort. They will make sure that they try to build common ground with you. So that's a bit of what you were asking about. The second thing I think that's really interesting is I firmly believe that we are in a transformational moment. The fact that people don't want to go back to jobs with low wages and bad working conditions, I mean, it's not just temporary. I think people are questioning the role of work in their lives. They're questioning the role of how they get treated and respected or disrespected. I don't think that this moment of examining racial equity is temporary either. I think people have woken up to the fact that racist policing is the tip of a racist iceberg, and that we need to deal with structural racism to be able to move forward. And I don't think that the conversation around the climate is about, just improving things a little bit. People realize that there's a planet at stake. And in the midst of these transformational moments, it's important to realize that movements aren't just instrumental, they're fundamental. Movements aren't just a way of changing policy a little bit. They're about creating the habits of mutuality and solidarity that we need. And in that movement moment in which we understand that just as markets make us selfish, movements can make us mutual. That part of the task is coming up with new language and narrative and visions. And that's what I think, interestingly, I'm hearing the field call for. Not just a better, carbon price, not just a better vehicle for moving toward electric vehicles, but a deep understanding that if you want to change the system of how we deliver power to people, we have to change the system of governing power and make sure that it's by the people.
Nailah, I'm interested to hear you talk a little bit. One of the things that I think Manuel is pointing to is that we don't just need the facts and the research to show what needs to happen better in our economy, but it needs to have force in society, right? In our governance structures, in the power relationships, and in what moves people. In the book, we talk about connecting facts with feelings, resonating with people's values and experience with force. And I wonder if you can talk a bit about in your work and what you've seen make a difference in changing policy or politics or practice in the world. How have you seen research link with the coalition's work and making change?
So I'm actually going to not use a climate plan experience, but I'm going to use an experience from my organizing days. I say that as if they're super far behind me, but I was a part of a neighborhood effort, and our goal was to stop a natural gas storage in our neighborhood. And we were a community that was scrappy. I mean, we didn't have the facts. We didn't really know. All we knew is something about storing natural gas under our neighborhood didn't sound right. And the other thing we knew is it didn't sound right that they were coming to our neighborhood, a low income, predominantly older population, and also predominantly at the time, Southeast Asian and Black community. And they weren't going to the more affluent or whiter communities. And we were just a scrappy neighborhood that knew that something was wrong about this. And at the same time, there were folks doing research that felt the same way. And it wasn't until there was the blend of resources, of knowledge, and of passion, and folks with lived experiences. It wasn't until they came together that we actually had a chance. Before, we were just to be really honest, we were just a scrappy bunch of like folks of color yelling into a void about like, hey, we don't think this is right. And it's something about the two coming together that helps legitimize movements. And I mean, I have a lot of qualms about that because I think communities should be able to say that they can't breathe, and that should be enough for us to be able to want to improve air quality, but that's not the case. And I also see a lot of institutions and researchers that have amazing studies that just sit on shelves. And so I am very interested in making sure that those worlds blend. I think when I talk to, excuse me if this is like too graphic for folks. I'm very casual, as you guys will find. But I tell folks when I talk at universities, like, if you give me your facts and research as an organizer, I will use it as a weapon. I will obliterate anybody else because I can find the passionate community that, needs this help. And your research is the weapon that we need. So I think it's just really important to blend the two as much as possible.
If I could add something to that, I think that's so completely spot on. And the thing I would add is that just as research legitimates movements, movements legitimate research. So, when we were writing this book, we started with conversations with movement actors saying, what are the difficulties you're experiencing when you're trying to make economic arguments for things that are right? And one of the things we need to change within the incentive structures of universities is to make sure that research doesn't stay on shelves and that also lived experience is used as a way of validating or legitimizing the research. So I just want to make it kind of a two-way point that Nailah is making.
Well, and I love the imagery of weaponizing research for social justice movements. And one of the things that I think is so profound about the example you gave, which I have some familiarity with, that South Sacramento natural gas storage proposal, is that it's an example where empowered communities of color were able to stop this natural gas storage facility, which actually has environmental benefits for everyone. And it's one of the things that we point to in some of the research in the book, and I think comes from some of the movement experiences, is that where you have more environmental equity, you actually have environmental quality. And I wonder, both Natalie and Nailah, if you want to talk a little bit more about that connection of places that you've seen where communities of color getting access to better environments and fighting environmental pollution has broader benefits for others as well.
I can chime in, and I'm going to take the example of like transportation in LA, which isn't that great, but transportation across the state is actually one of the biggest greenhouse gas emitters. And so trying to encourage people to drive less is what we want to do, whether that's big trucks or small cars. And so unfortunately, taking public transportation, the bus, or also even like riding bikes, is like not a dignified kind of experience in LA. It feels like second class to not have a car. And I think there are places in lower income communities where it's like, okay, that's what folks do. There's bus stops here. But Climate Resolve is advocating to put more bus stops and like have hydration stations at the bus stops, have lighting, make it a dignified experience, have a mobile charging station, things that would make people want to take the bus. I mean, they're already taking the bus, but it feels second class, if that makes sense. And so, trying to address the greater pollution issue of like transportation, which is the greatest greenhouse gas emitter in California. We want to make that like dignified for folks that don't necessarily like have cars and are taking the bus. And so also thinking about heat waves and things like that. When folks don't have bus shelters, they're more at risk for heat exhaustion, dehydration, heat stroke. The buses sometimes don't come on time. So we're also like advocating for faster frequent service, and have worked with the city and Metro to build those bus shelters that include the hydration stations, solar powered lighting, digital bus maps with real time arrival information, and a place to charge personal electronic devices. So I just wanted to bring up that example that's very local to LA.
Yeah, it's a great example. Nailah, did you have other examples you wanted to share on that?
Yeah, well, I think this kind of nexus around like if we really focus on environmental justice, how it's going to benefit everyone is really why I engage in this work. Because I think it, to me, like I said earlier, right, I think there is, if we ignore it, there will come a time where folks with privilege, white folks, are going to be able to buy their way out of the climate crisis for a long time, where folks in my community, not even my community, I'll personalize it. I was shocked when it got hotter this year sooner and my bills went up. And I was just like, whoa, where's this adjustment is actually affecting my life. And so I think for me, for folks I grew up with, it's just more pressing. But I was going to use a transportation example as well. I think thinking about like solidarity economics and environmental justice and this whole movement and what the potential here is what we're talking about is like building interconnected communities. And that benefits everyone. And so at ClimatePlan, one of the things that we're always advocating for is like more money in active transportation and the development of bicycle networks. And that has its greenhouse gas emission, benefits. But at the heart of it, it really is about making sure that like people that live in communities have access to the resources they need and that they can connect to one another. So I just think it's really important to make that linkage between like environmental quality and, environmental equity.
That's great. Thank you.
I'll add something quickly to that. I'm a rather generous academic, so I'm never jealous of other academics. The only time I've been jealous is when my good friend Michael Ash did a study which has the best title, Is Environmental Justice Good for White Folks? And basically what they did was they looked at where there were more environmental disparities, and region by region, metro region by metro region in the United States. And they found that when there were more disparities, there was actually just more pollution, and it actually affected white people more. That when you think it's going to be in someone else's backyard, you wind up not dealing with it. When you think that if there's a hurricane, it's only the lower Ninth Ward that's going to be nailed, you don't protect it, and then New Orleans as a whole gets wiped out. When you think that who's going to be suffering from a heat stroke is a farm worker and you don't stop to think about how to protect that person, you're winding up not dealing with the issues that are going to emerge in the food chain and wind up affecting everyone. So I think this is a really central point, and I think we've seen it both in Oakland and in Los Angeles, Long Beach too, around the ports, and the fact that it's the environmental justice communities around those ports that have fought so hard for reducing emissions from those ports, which has had tremendous benefits in terms of both general air pollution and public health and greenhouse gas emissions for both of those regions.
I'll remind those of you listening to this conversation that we want to be in conversation with you too. So please put your questions in the chat. We've gotten a number so far, and we'll get to them in a few minutes. What I'd love to shift a little bit now to actually builds on Manuel's example of the ports in LA and Long Beach, because there's an example in some ways where the global economy is rooted in literally people's backyards and the air they breathe. And in this moment today, COP26 in Glasgow, they just announced a consensus agreement that countries are not doing enough to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but still far short of agreements about what really needs to be done to keep climate change in check. Thinking about these connections between these global processes and state and local work, I think is really important. How do we connect what we're doing in our own communities with broader impacts? And both of you have tremendous experience at working at both that local level and then particularly at a state level, but also connections with national and global movements. And I'd love to hear you both talk about in this moment of COP26 and the climate crisis and this renewed attention to across our society, racial justice issues. How do you see those connections between work at a local level and state and national and global work? And Nailah, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I think one of the beautiful things about ClimatePlan is of our 50 organizations that are members, it is a range from small, like neighborhood-based nonprofits and some of like the national nonprofits that are all focused on climate change or some subset of that. And so I think one of the ways that we lead that is we make sure that as we're talking about policy, that it is informed by folks on the ground that are actually going to be the practitioners or going to see it actualized. And we also are having that conversation about then how do we write policy in a way that it trickles down, and how do we make sure that there's a continuous feedback loop so folks on the ground can say how relevant it is and we can make adjustments. I think it's really important to like just focus on the fact that you need multiple levels to inform, even like at a national level, you need regional, you need local folks to be able to inform that work. And then I think you also have to, back to like the other roots of ClimatePlan, talk about the interconnectedness of issues. You can't just make policy or inform policy on a single issue, but when you talk about air quality, you have to talk about transportation, you have to talk about housing, and you have to find ways for those intersections to be able to be highlighted.
Great. Thank you. And Natalie, I'll turn to you.
Yeah, so I mentioned a couple of local examples already, the work that Climate Resolve did with the LA County Climate Vulnerability Assessment, which was us facilitating some engagement around a scientific type of report, and then also advocating for bus shelters and trying to work with the city and Metro in LA around transportation. Climate Resolve a lot of times uses these case study examples to take to a state level to inform budget cycles and trying to get better policies that are ultimately going to be implemented at a local level. So it's like a feedback stream, both back and forth. But one of the programs that I love that I help co-facilitate is called Partners Advancing Climate Equity. And I work as a curriculum kind of trainer to work with 21 frontline leaders from across the state that are doing great work in their community, but they might be like very small. They might have like 3 staff, and they want to access some of the billions of dollars that the state of California has for climate change, but haven't been so successful in like grant writing or project management, kind of need communication tools to get the word out about what they're doing. And they're juggling. We're all constantly juggling so much work. And so that program started up in February of this year. It's going through March of next year. And it's been great to work with these leaders to try and train them up to do their own work in their communities and try to get ultimately more resources for it. So be able to talk in a way and write grants in a way where funders are going to be able to give money to the work, and hopefully they'll be able to have more capacity. It's a capacity building type of program ultimately.
What I hear you both talking about is the importance of community voices informing policy, but also community voices being involved in implementation. And one of the other aspects of implementation I'm curious about from your experience is where, a policy that's developed in Sacramento or Washington ends up either having unintended consequences at a local level that community voices can help make clear, or ends up being a vehicle for greenwashing. Where other entities can use it as a vehicle to do business as usual. And I wonder if either of you have examples of sort of that element of the community voices being really important in ensuring accountability of implementation.
I do. I'll just build off of that program I was talking about. I mean, these frontline leaders are already doing great work, and like we're working to help apply for grants and things like that. And so like the state hires me or my organization to help folks apply to grants. And they're just really technical. And sometimes I go back to the state and say, make the application easier. You don't have to hire me to help folks apply. Just make the application easier for frontline leaders to get the money. And so I think that's one of the sometimes bureaucratic things that happens just coming together, and that's great. That's a huge accomplishment. But also thinking about minimizing the red tape to like access those resources, not just giving them to like the big companies or the consultant agencies that are going to be primed to kind of like get that funding, but make it very easy for smaller organizations to access, I think is important.
Nailah?
Yeah, I have a very similar example around like just electrification and electrification rebates and the amount of forms and paperwork that is involved in making sure that folks in disadvantaged communities have access to, all of the tools when we say we want to make sure that we're equitably distributing or equitably finding a way to move to an all electric, fleet. But the paperwork is so cumbersome and in many ways actually can hurt the communities in ways where the rebates are counted as income. So it knocks people off of assistance. And we were able to help relay that back to the programs, and we're able to help make those fix and streamline actually giving people the help that they need.
So great examples. And Manuel, I'm curious in your experience and research, you mentioned in your keynote today the importance of we need policy change, but we also need changes in the politics and practices. You've been involved in the research behind the Cal Enviro screen, helping to identify vulnerable communities and work on the ground in that. I wonder if you could talk a bit about that link between implementation and the importance of community voices.
Well, I think it's incredibly important to have communities be involved in implementation and monitoring to make sure that promises that might be made actually get lived up to. And I think it's also really key as a set of processes to continue to build community capacity to do exactly that. And it's also, you can win things in policy, but if they never get delivered on the ground, then people who are organized to win that policy are going to wind up feeling disempowered. And so all of that kind of connection is really important. I think there's another thing which I always like to highlight in these conversations, in particular, because we're talking a lot about the role of low-income communities, communities of color in terms of environmental policy and implementation. And I want to say a word about the politics. For about the last 12 years, the Public Policy Institute of California has been polling Californians and asking the question, particularly in the last, usually they're asking just about the environment, but in the last 5 to 10 years, asking about climate. And do you think the climate crisis is a very important problem for quality of life and the economy in California? And the results are quite interesting, because when most people think about environmentalists, what they imagine is white folks from Marin. Hi, Bioneers. But what you find in the data is that about 50% of white Californians believe that the climate crisis is very serious, threatening our quality of life. About 57, 58% of Black and Asian AAPI Californians believe it's very serious. And about 2/3 of Latinos think that it's very serious. So, and by the way, that doesn't, the difference in those communities about whether or not they think dealing with the climate has economic costs or economic benefits, there's virtually no ethnic difference. So it's not coming from a different sense of the economic trade-offs that are usually posed in the public imagination, many of which don't exist. It's that these groups deeply care about climate because climate is experienced not just as something distant, but as heat waves in communities that don't have sufficient tree canopy, experienced as asthma for children, etc. And so the politics of this is that centering the struggle against environmental injustice animates the constituencies we need to build a broad and sustainable movement to deal with the broader climate crisis. So this is one of the instances of many in which dealing with equity aligns policy and aligns politics in the directions we need to really do something that's good for all of us.
Thank you for that, all of you. I want to turn a little bit now to questions from our audience. And again, just a reminder, please pop them in the chat and we'll hopefully get a chance to answer as many as we can. And there's some questions that are more generally about solidarity economics and sort of our approach to different parts of that, maybe I'll turn to you first, Manuel, and then see if Nailah and Natalie have comments on it. One has to do with thinking about alternative trade organizations like equal exchange. And, I think you could think of other examples of trying to have values, organics or whatever else, reflected in the consumer goods that we buy and sell. How do you see that fitting into a solidarity economics framework, Manuel?
Chris, you're a moderator, but you're also a co-author. And I gave a keynote speaking about certain parts of this. So let me ask you that question. Chris, what do you think about these alternative trade mechanisms? So we bring you into the conversation as well.
Okay. So, I think it's important to recognize that values are embedded in everything we buy or sell, whether it's labeled that way or not. And it's often made invisible to us. One of the other questions, for example, that we're going to talk about in a bit is energy. I buy energy every day, and most of us do if we have it in our homes. We don't know who owns and runs those energy sources on our bill. It's, invisible except for PG&E there. We don't have the details of it, or whoever your utility provider is. So I think the more we can make the social relations of production more visible, that's a great part of solidarity economics. It's part of what we're really trying to argue. Much of the equal exchange movement has started from small producers, coffee growers in Central America, or women's cooperatives in South Africa, some of the work that I had a chance to help build and support. And I think that's really important. It's part of building a movement, but we need it at scale. And so I think we need to be focusing on what are the major products that people buy as part of their lives, and how do we make the values that are visible in those, or that are invisible, make them more visible, so we can be clearer about how our values and what we buy and sell shapes our economy overall.
Tricked you.
Thanks for bringing me into the conversation.
Natalie was going to say something.
I am. So I live in Long Beach, which is home to one of the biggest ports facilities, in the country. And so many goods crisscross like through my community on like freeways and with heavy duty diesel trucks to go to different warehouses and rail yards like across the Los Angeles region. And so some folks, internalize that as like what they purchase or what I purchase is coming in on those trucks. And I tried personally to think about like how am I supporting local? And I was sharing before the panel started, like I'm moving into a new house. And there's a great group in Long Beach that's very grassroots. It's called like Buy Nothing. And they're actually like all over the nation too. But I'm getting so much mutual aid and support and solidarity from my neighbors that are trying to exchange their stuff for free rather than purchasing more goods. And I think this is coming into play as we see the supply chain be more gridlocked, but it's also a recognition of like how many resources are already in the community. And so it gives me a lot of hope in solidarity economics, and it's more of like a personal thing. I think Climate Resolve does some advocacy on like trying to get zero emission technologies in the ports. But I think even personally thinking about consumer goods and alternative trade, it comes into play for me on a personal level, just trying to move and get my resources from the local community.
If I might add one thing, one group we profile in the book is the Restaurant Opportunity Center, the Let's Become One Fair Wage. And looking at the exploitation in the restaurant industry, they've taken three paths. They've tried to organize workers to be able to stand up for their rights. They've tried to organize cooperatives so that workers form their own restaurants, cooperative, what normally people think of as the solidarity economy. And the third thing they've tried to do is to launch a campaign for high road restaurants. That is, restaurants that treat their workers better so that consumers can be making the invisible visible and essentially purchasing a more ethical and equitable product. I think too often we counterpose those three strategies as being distinct, and we need to war over which one is the best one. Organizing workers, organizing co-ops, or trying to alter the economy by really using our consumer power to force business to do the right thing. And I would argue that we really need to be doing all three of those, as well as, of course, getting the government involved and establishing a baseline about what should happen.
Great, thank you. Another question. Oh, Nailah, do you want to add?
Well, I wasn't going to add much. I was just going to kind of piggyback off of what Natalie was saying, in that in a lot of our communities, this work is already happening, and maybe not on a large scale, on a micro scale, but I think it is more important to figure out, I would say, to figure out how we replicate that in micro neighborhood, or at a micro scale across multiple neighborhoods, than some big sweeping system. Like, we can lean into the networks that are already built. With COVID, big mutual aid efforts happened, and we need to figure out how to empower those efforts to be sustained.
That's great.
Yeah, 100% agree with that. COVID did catalyze some mutual aid that should be long-term.
On that mutual aid points to one of the other questions was, how can we create greater economic control by communities over their own energy utilities. And I'll just say a little bit in response to this question, because I'm actually at the moment in the midst of looking seriously at getting solar panels on our house. And it's made me realize how problematic the governance of our energy systems is. And the mechanics of it are complex. But one of the things is, we have this net energy metering where if you have panels on your house, you feed energy back into the grid. And PG&E at the moment and other utilities have a one-to-one essentially trade-off. You feed it in, they pay you for your energy, and you can take their energy and pay them for that at a one-to-one basis. But we're in the midst of negotiations in the state of California. In an ideal policy world, you'd want to increase it. You'd want to incentivize decentralizing energy production. And in fact, PG&E and others are pushing in the opposite direction of trying to reduce the amount they're compensating homeowners for solar energy. And it's a complex story, but I think part of it is pointing to who are the voices at that table. And Natalie, you mentioned some work on energy earlier, and I just wondered for both of you, do you have insights or solutions that I mentioned one other thing coming back to the mutual aid, that turns out something like 12% of all energy in this country is provided by electricity cooperatives. It's a place where actually cooperatives are pretty significant scale, and they also manage something like 70% of the electricity grid, the infrastructure, because much of those electricity cooperatives are in rural areas. So it's again a case where mutuality is deeply embedded in a fundamental part of our economy, stemming much from the New Deal era, where we could build on those lessons and expand it for greater cooperative governance. But Natalie, tell us a little bit about your perspectives on energy and how we could improve energy governance.
Yes, so Climate Resolve does a little bit of work on trying to pilot like innovative technologies, and this kind of like around cool roofs. Cool roofs are something that are put on buildings that reflect sun rays back into the atmosphere. And that's something that we were able to advocate and get adopted as like a local ordinance, but ultimately helps reduce energy use in a building. And we also do work around cool pavements, which does the same thing, but for asphalt. And arguably, like folks that are walking on the street and have that on their street might have to use their energy and air conditioning less. There is a link I put in the chat because as I'm thinking about being a homeowner, there's also other types of programs of piloting technology. And I don't know how many people in the audience are living in California, but I just found out about like a heat pump water heater program that they're piloting. So getting residents to install this, and then they're doing some studies. So I think sometimes Climate Resolve will, as an organization, get asked to kind of pilot and help promote innovative technologies. And it's really important, the role that Climate Resolve plays with energy utility companies, because ultimately we want folks to transition to being less fossil fuel oriented. And so that's why I share that link in the chat, but I also share like the importance of being open to doing pilot programs.
That's brilliant. Nate? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't have a good answer here because I know we've been racking our brain for the last almost year, at least in some of our work that ClimatePlan's doing in Sacramento, to figure out how the building electrification ordinance is going to be passed and how we equitably retrofit existing buildings in a way that doesn't gentrify or displace anyone. And so that is, that is something that I think I haven't found the answer to. So if anyone in the audience does, please send it out. Please reach out. But I think it's just really important. It's a really important question. And with so many moving parts about our energy sector and electrifying, it's just really important to hold all of them, I think, at the same time.
Yeah. One of the things I really appreciate about your point, Nailah, is that often, the solution to the question is actually looking at the related areas that we don't often think about. So energy efficiency and building efficiency. People use the term negawatt. Like if you can use less energy, that's another way of improving our energy footprint as well as switching to renewables. And I think one of the other things that's really important in ClimatePlan's work is around that transportation nexus, that actually if we can build affordable housing closer to where people work, then you don't need to spend money on transportation infrastructure in the way that produces greenhouse gas emissions. There's a question in the audience here, and again, I encourage you to ask other questions that has to do, I think, with how do we help make the movement for climate justice more visible and more widespread and more of sort of a popular reality. And it's hearkening back to the AIDS crisis, and some of you may remember the AIDS quilt. And the question is, what do you think about a national and local climate change quilt of people who have died in climate-related disasters, to bring home both locally and nationally how many people are dying from these unnatural disasters every year and even monthly? What do you think about that idea? Any of you?
I mean, I think about trying to acknowledge the pandemic that we're into, COVID-19. And I don't know if we'll have a quilt on that, but think about climate change related to like what we're going through now, and that if we don't address climate change, unfortunately, I think deaths can happen like they did in COVID-19, or they are, right? And it's a really grim reality, but we've seen so much destruction in California with the wildfires year after year. And then with heat wave, Climate Resolve calls it like the silent killer. Like, we don't adequately in California count how many folks die on a really hot day when they have to work outside, or they're in their home and they don't have adequate air conditioning, and they live alone and they're elderly. And those sometimes are attributed to pre-existing conditions, but not necessarily like a heat wave. And so I'm just thinking about trying to hold on to the COVID-19 era and like what we're in, and try to like grab people's attention and say, look, this was a really horrific experience that a lot of people are still dealing with, the mental health impacts and everything. And there is this other wave. Like, I think there's a graphic on this where there's like, the wave of COVID, and then there's like a bigger tsunami coming that is climate change. And that's what's happening. I think it's like a crisis that's weaved into another crisis. And just my response is like wanting to address both of those as like we're going through it, and not thinking of them as like two separate.
Mm-hmm. Either the other of you want to talk about the climate quilt idea?
Yeah, I want to second everything that Natalie said, where I think we focus on interconnection. But I also really, I will say, at first it felt performative, right? It feels a little performative. I think the best way to get more visibility on the environmental justice movement is, if you have visibility, give it to folks with environmental justice issues, or, climate justice issues. I think we have to figure out how to share space and share power. And I think the more that we can do that, the more visibility will also build, if we are always centering frontline communities.
Yeah, I appreciate that point. One of the things I was thinking about in answer to this question is sort of two things. One is, it's important in organizing work for people to have tangible hands-on experience of doing things to make a difference. And part of that is, the building trust and building a sense of power and agency and ability to work together with others to push for change. And, maybe producing an AIDS quilt around this, square might help make that connection, and help make connections in, heat waves or drought or other things that link to that. But, I guess the other thing that really struck me in that, Nailah, this harkens back to some of the conversations that we had in preparation for this panel of, thinking about, are we in a transformative moment in which, coming out of the pandemic has made visible all the illnesses that our society has had, and, the racial justice movements of last year and the continuing issues there. And, and I'd love to hear you talk and maybe elaborate on this point. You made the point is that, we needed this transformative movement decades ago, if not hundreds ago, and our communities of color in the most impacted communities from climate change and environmental pollution knew that. And so how do we make those voices more visible as we're also trying to take advantage of this moment?
Yeah, I in no way want to minimize the impacts of COVID in my community, but a lot of the issues that are happening today and a lot of the problems around like just income inequality, access to resources are things that we've been talking about for decades. And so it is a little facetious to say we're in a transformative moment because for a lot of these communities, things haven't transformed. There's not a big awakening that's happening for these communities. We have more vocabulary of it, but really it's because people with privilege have more awareness of it. And more interest in engaging in the conversations. But these are conversations that have been happening for a really long time. And so I think there has to be some acknowledgement, though, around, folks that have been on the front line for a really long time, engaging with these issues, fighting these issues, trying to make progress with folks that are coming, into it now. It's not to discourage folks from wanting to get involved, but I think it was very similar to what Manuel said in the beginning, like, you will be called in. There is a moment where you need to be called into this work.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
I want to add something to this. First, I recall, I've done a lot of work around the COVID crisis, and I recall at the, month's end talking about the difference in mortality, particularly age-adjusted mortality for Black and Latino Californians, and talking about that as being rooted in structural racism. And I had someone say, well, isn't that difference in mortality rate due to obesity and diabetes and hypertension? And I said, yes, those are all diseases of racism. That's when your neighborhood doesn't have good food, doesn't have places for you to exercise, and you're Black in America. That's a pretty stressful situation. So I think people wind up looking for excuses to explain the patterns rather than trying to really understand those patterns that have been there, that have felt real to communities, etc. The second thing I want to say, and I hate to be the bummer in this audience, is that, moments of change, potentially transformation, could also be pretty ugly. The Depression gave us the New Deal, and importantly, the New Deal in the United States was quite racially exclusive. It also gave us fascism in Europe. And yes, we're in the middle of a COVID crisis where the disease has revealed our illnesses as a society, and people are questioning inequality, racial disparity, and so much else. But nearly 800,000 people have died, and so many are not willing to take the vaccine because they're being led into a delusion by the forces on the right. And we need to understand that in this moment, we have some really dangerous forces that are being unleashed in the nation that could stand in the way of progress. So as much I want to stress mutuality, we need to stress movements. We need to have a very warm heart, but we need to have a very cold head about what we need to do to tackle the forces that would destroy the planet and destroy people.
Yeah, that's so important. We have about 10 minutes left, so if anyone has any other questions, please put them in the chat and we'll try and get to them. One of the questions here has to do with sometimes difficult conversations in building a coalition and allies, and it has to do with the relationship with unions. And of course, in earlier generations, there's the sort of story of unions versus environmentalists around environmental conservation. And I think we've come a long way since those days. And I'd point to groups like the Blue-Green Alliance, which is a very specific effort to try and bring together labor unions and environmental groups. And I think there's quite a number of examples in the LA area that maybe Natalie and Manuel can talk about where unions coming together to create good wage jobs in transportation sectors and renewable energy sectors and waste have been a really important way of building those alliances. But Natalie, maybe I'll start with you. Do you have any experience in the work you're doing at Climate Resolve of working with unions and the challenge of and the opportunities of linking environmental and labor work?
Not from my org, but personally, my boyfriend's a refuge trash operator. And so there has been work like for City of LA and I think City of Long Beach thinking about how to improve safety and environmental concerns. I don't know if you know this, but Long Beach burns its trash and we have an incinerator and it impacts the communities around Wilmington, San Pedro, Long Beach. And it's just a real issue to think about how environmental pollution is just coupling on each other. And we talked about consumerism and alternative trade. And we buy a lot of stuff. And so we have a lot of waste. And then the folks that are picking up the waste aren't necessarily have the best safety mechanisms in doing it. And then it goes to an incinerator. So unionizing around all these issues, I think is really important. But I don't think we've gotten there yet. And I can't speak to, I guess, the right solution since I don't exactly work on it, but I can tell you the context of at least that situation.
Manuel, do you want? Oh, Nailah, go ahead.
Well, yeah, we've done a lot of work, especially in the transportation sector, as we talk about going electric with the Electric Workers Union. We talk with ATU, the Bus Drivers Union, about figuring out how we can find, how we can have some of these conversations and advocate for the same thing. More money for public transit is good for the climate and also good for the folks that are driving the buses. And so we really try and lean into those conversations. I think another framing that we've really been trying to lean into is just these unions are made of workers and will benefit as well. And we're really, I think at ClimatePlan, we've really been trying to lean into building out that relationship because they're so important to make sure that unions are involved and a part of this conversation.
So I think that there's a lot of sweet spots for work. For example, Natalie was mentioning the trash and recycling in Los Angeles has been fundamentally redone in a way that's encouraged union workers and, better environmental conditions. There's also tensions out there. For example, lots of communities favor distributed solar. Lots of unions want big solar farms because that's a little bit easier to organize workers who are going to go to a central spot than to organize workers installing solar panels on Chris's house. There's also a lot of tensions between environmentalists and some parts of construction because the environmentalists are very suspicious of carbon capture, but of course building carbon sequestration plumbing is something that could yield a lot of jobs. So one of the things I think is important to do is to stay in the conversation, figure out where there are alliances, grow those areas of common ground more, and then to echo something I think Nailah said earlier, to understand where you're going to disagree and where you're going to fight. And you might come back later, but there might be a struggle about distributed solar versus solar farms. There might be a struggle about how we do electrification, but you'll come back to the table at another time.
Great. And as we move towards wrapping up in our last 5 minutes, I want to make sure we end on a call to action and thinking about supporting movements. And so Natalie and Nailah, I'll start with the two of you about when you think about your work and going forward, what do you hope our listeners do to know more about your work, to be involved? What would you communicate as a call to action for people on our panel audience today?
Yeah, I can go first since Natalie's been going first a lot. I would say one of the things that's in my notes that I didn't really talk about, and I think it's a great thing to end it on, is being involved in movements, one of the really important things that gets lost in a lot of conversation is the celebration of the collective. And I think it is one of the most affirming and most powerful things you can do. And the celebration of wins that, I mean, while trust me, I do climate change policy, we need the big wins. We need to lower our emissions. We need to do all of that. But there's also something really gratifying about a stop sign in a neighborhood or a community member finding their voice. And all of that is also a part of movement building and solidarity economics. And so I would say lean into those pieces as much as possible too. And there's so much beauty and celebration and collectiveness that happens in movement building.
Thank you. Natalie?
I have an easy ask. I put my link to the organization in the chat. You can sign up for our newsletter. What I love about our newsletter and like the work that we do is it's a hub of information for work that's being done in California, ways to get involved with events, but also just other news releases and to stay up to date on information that's going on. So that's an easy ask to the audience to just stay updated on the work we're doing.
Thank you. Manuel, what's your call to action?
Well, we've got two members of this panel who are movement activists and deep thinkers, and they've called for movement action. And then we've got two academics who have ties to movements. We hope we're deep thinkers. So I'd like to make a call to action to, researchers and the next generation of graduate students and others, that the kind of work that's in the book we're sharing is something that emerged from working with movement actors, recognizing the quality of thought, the depth of lived experience, and how much we need to be responsible to that as academics and find a vehicle to express it. So if you really want some satisfaction in your life as an academic, I can think of no better thing to do than to find your way to a community-based organization that might be looking for some research, might be looking for a real and authentic alliance and engagement. So let me call on my people, those academic nerds that might have inadvertently tuned in.
Well, and I'll just mention one thing to those academic colleagues, if any of them are here, that we're hosting a conference next October 26th through 28th on co-creating knowledge for justice, which is bringing together people around the country who are doing that kind of community engaged research to share what we've learned in doing that process and why it's so important in being in conversation with and learning from our movement colleagues for our academic work as well. And I guess my last call to action is this concept of solidarity economics emerged out of conversations, and it's a point in an evolution. And we really hope that this becomes the basis for ongoing conversations about how these ideas might relate to building a better economy where we're investing in our mutuality rather than markets and competition. So the website that we've linked there has a comic book on solidarity economics that we're working on to figure out other ways of communicating this work. We're building videos, short pieces to try and emphasize different aspects of how solidarity economics can apply to universal basic income, to social housing, to solidarity in the planet and other ways. So please go to that site and be in conversation with all of us. And the final thing is to make sure you learn more about the work of ClimatePlan and Climate Resolve and all the environmental justice leaders in our state and in our country, because they're doing amazing work and we all have to help learn from the work they're doing and support and lift that up. So thank you all for joining us, and Natalie and Nailah in particular, thank you so much for spending your time with us today and sharing your work.